Hello, and welcome to this special recorded Q&A for the Diplomatic Pouch, the online magazine of the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. I'm Kelly McFarland, Director of Programs and Research at ISD. The fans of the world's most popular sport turn their attention to Qatar this week, as the 2022 FIFA World Cup gets underway. 32 national teams will meet, and on December 18th, a winner will be crowned. Massive global sporting events like this attract politicians and celebrities, stoke national pride, and perhaps surprisingly to many watching this, provide a unique opportunity to practice diplomacy. Sports offer an influential avenue to engage with the world, promote economic growth, and foster more resilient communities. Unfortunately, this year's World Cup in Qatar has been mired in allegations of corruption and human rights abuses, challenging Qatar's prospects for effective sports diplomacy at the Games. Joining us to talk about the world of sports diplomacy and how we might see it in action in Qatar over the next several weeks is Dr. Lindsay Sarah Krasnoff. She is a historian, writer, speaker, and consultant working at the intersection of global sports, communications, and diplomacy. A sports diplomacy specialist pioneering work within the basketball diplomacy framework and a leading expert on French sport, she is the author of The Making of Les Bleus, Sport in France, 1958 to 2010, and the forthcoming book, Basketball Empire, France and the Making of a Global NBA and WNBA, and a veteran of the U.S. Department of State. And I should also mention she's also an author of a recent ISD case study on the Basketball Africa League, which you can find in a link below. Lindsay, thanks so much for joining us to talk about the World Cup.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, let's start off with sort of a 30,000 foot level question for our listeners and I guess those who are watching this. Give us a little bit of a background on what do we mean by sports diplomacy and why do states pursue it?
Sure. Well, so sports diplomacy is a newer phrase for an ages-old practice. Sports diplomacy is when the acts of diplomacy, representation, communication, and negotiation intersect in and around the sporting arena. Historically, sports diplomacy and diplomacy more generally has been the domain of official state representatives. So ambassadors, diplomats, heads of state, or elite athletes representing their nation in international competitions such as the Olympics or the FIFA World Cups. However, in a 21st century in which we are interconnected in so many different ways through transportation, the internet, so many different digital entities, plus having a very global modern sports industry, the concept of who engages in sports diplomacy has become more diffuse. And increasingly, it's everyday citizens who can engage in what we call people-to-people sports exchanges. This is the cultural, technical, and knowledge exchange that organically occurs in and around the sporting terrain, particularly within the professional sports arena, but also at the elite level for international competition, as well as at the grassroots level and amateur levels. So when we talk about sports diplomacy, this is what we mean. We often kind of distinguish in terms of whether it is formal sports diplomacy or informal sports diplomacy. Formal sports diplomacy, there is always that official state representative involved, whether it's national teams at the FIFA World Cup or ambassadors, diplomats, tournament host committee members, for example. Informal diplomacy, however, centers in and around what is often referred to as non-state sports actors. So everyday individuals like you, like me, members of the Georgetown basketball teams, for example. And that is, the greater majority of sports diplomacy today. So this is our understanding of sports diplomacy and who engages in it. And there's many different ways that it can look in a variety of different ways. States pursue it. So returning to the formal sports diplomacy concept, states pursue sports diplomacy for a multitude of reasons. It is a way to help to generate and cultivate soft power, the ability to influence others through leadership and other entities through, helping to showcase a nation's culture through sports and its cultural endeavors. And a really interesting thing that we've seen emerging over the past 10, 15 years in terms of why states pursue sports diplomacy are some of the more hard, tangible benefits that we've seen in terms of tourism, sporting tourism. Increasingly, several different governments around the world, as they're formalizing or refreshing their official sports diplomacy policy, are looking at the benefits of sports tourism as one part of that. Um, the contributions to the job market and to GDP for hosting major tournaments is also a consideration. And you'll see that increasingly, particularly within, say, FIFA as well as FIBA, the International Basketball Federation, after these major tournaments for the past several years, they produce economic impact reports that measure the kind of economic impact that hosting these sorts of sports diplomacy endeavors have had.
So it's a lot of different things that are going on here, and I appreciate your answer on that and demonstrating that. And I think it's not just Forrest Gump playing ping pong with the Chinese here. So I'm not quite sure where that would fall in the sports diplomacy realm. But so moving on to Qatar specifically. So why is Qatar? We think of Qatar and we don't necessarily think World Cup, right? I mean, there's a reason we're playing it in November and December right now, because it's really hot in the summer.
Right.
This had to shift everything to the fall and winter, and it's a tiny state relatively. I'm not a soccer powerhouse, so what's in it for Qatar? Basically, what did they see in this, and then how does FIFA make the decision on who gets it? And that sort of brings us to that elephant in the room, which is the human rights abuses and the corruption that's tied to this year's World Cup.
Sure. Big question. So, kind of starting at the beginning, what does hosting the FIFA World Cup bring? What does it bring Qatar? Right. From the very get-go, the Qatar has used hosting of this World Cup tournament to help propel several state projects and infrastructure projects. So it has helped fuel infrastructure and construction and growth. It has also helped to put Qatar on the map in terms of international affairs through sports, not necessarily for its sporting on-field or on-pitch performances, although certainly in the lead up to hosting the World Cup, they have made every effort to invest in their football, their soccer programs, and to some of their teams have been winning at different levels. But in terms of what hosting the tournament has been able to inject Qatar into conversations that, prior to winning the right to host the World Cup more than 10 years ago, no one really talked about Qatar in those ways. It's part of a larger sports diplomacy strategy in which Qatar has used sports to become a much more influential player internationally. It's not just hosting the FIFA World Cup. They've also purchased the professional team of the French capital, Paris Saint-Germain, and through that have infused a lot of money and energy into French football. Also, its sports broadcasting company, BN Sports, has grown significantly over the past 10 years. Being a mainstay in certain parts of Europe, BN Sports also has a big audience and market in Latin America as well. And those are just three examples. Qatar has been involved in sponsoring other sporting events, but perhaps it is the FIFA World Cup that is kind of the crown jewel in that, in terms of just being the biggest platform. So that's a little bit about kind of what it helps to bring the state. In terms of how did FIFA make the choice of granting the right to host the World Cup to Qatar, that decision, there's a really great documentary on Netflix right now that tackles very much this exact question in granular detail, about how the FIFA Executive Committee in 2009 decided to award the rights to host the 2018 and the 2022 World Cups at the exact same time. And there's a lot of speculation in terms of what kinds of deals were made to try to influence the executive committee members for their votes. So these are, certainly allegations, and there's both sides of the story there. But in 2009, the FIFA Executive Committee did select Russia to host the 2018 World Cup and Qatar to host the 2022 edition. Very much, with the Qataris, they were up against many other, perhaps far more popular bids, bids that did not require playing football in the middle of the desert summer, which gets us to your point of why we're why we're about to embark on a FIFA World Cup at the end of the year. Um, and so, that's kind of the short explanation of how Qatar wound up hosting the World Cup. Um, the way that FIFA made its decisions for awarding the bids has since changed as a result of the systemic corruption that was exposed by a U.S. Department of Justice investigation and arrests several years ago. So it is much different now in terms of who chooses, who hosts all these various different tournaments.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see, over the course of the 10 plus years since Qatar got the World Cup. It'll be interesting to see what tangible benefits they can actually bring out of this, because there's been such bad press over that decade, whether it be the corruption or the human rights abuses with the workers that are building all these state of the art stadiums and everything. Can they actually get past that to get a net positive for their country out of this? I think that.
Right. Yeah. And I think the winning the right to host this World Cup has been a little bit of a double-edged sword for the Qataris. It has put them under an excruciating spotlight in a way that previous hosts have not really had to handle, and certainly not for such a long period of time. Right, 2009 to today, that's more than a decade. And while there are very legitimate and very grave human rights issues involved, not just in terms of the migrant workers, but also the LGBTQ community and much more. And those are very real and very valid. I think that you could make an argument that there have been some policy changes put into place since 2009 so that the situation is better. It's still not ideal. It's still not in line with perhaps Western standards. But I think there has been movement. And you get back to, well, what is the main objective of diplomacy? It is, to continue to have conversations and to try to influence, to achieve your objectives, to achieve goals. And even if you don't get 100% of what you want and what you ask for, it is kind of that negotiation aspect. So in this, I think, sports has served to help to, change some policies in Qatar. Have they changed fast enough, as totally enough? No. But I think that the use of sports in this case has helped.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I think you already mentioned too that FIFA has changed their actions on how they go about awarding who gets the games and everything too. So I think it's movement, still a long way to go, but movement in the right direction. So moving to the games themselves and beyond Qatar, there's also unique dynamics that go on as well, because, for instance, I think it's the week after next. I can't remember the date. Maybe November 29th. I think the U.S. plays Iran. So it's always an interesting point when the U.S. and Iran play, because we haven't had the best relationship with Iran over the last 40 years. But even today, with the protests that are ongoing in Iran, I saw something the other day where they might keep some players off the team that were showing some siding with the protesters a little bit. So there's a lot going on with that. Is it just a game, or is there more to it than that when the U.S. and Iran play, or when countries like that play and can possibly get something out of that?
It's never been just a game. I mean, you can go back decades. International sport has always been about more than a game. It's been about promoting different things over different periods of time. But I think it's very hard to justify those who argue that sports and politics should not mix, because they always have. Um, So I would start with that. I think the U.S. Iran match will be certainly one of high interest for many because of the reasons that you state, particularly given the protests, especially the ways that so many of the Iranian national athletes have been starting to speak up in support of the women's movement there. You know, the I know a lot of attention has been focused on the soccer team, but you know the water polo team very recently refused to sing the national anthem ahead of an international competition. So I think that that U.S. Iran match is going to be very interesting from a number of different ways, not just in terms of kind of the symbolism and the representation, but I'd also be very curious in terms of being the proverbial fly on the wall. I'd love to hear some of the the one-on-one conversations that the players might have with each other on the field, in whatever way their universes might possibly be able to interact through the World Cup. You know, I just want to point out one of the United States' other competitions in the first group phase, Wales, which is, when you talk about what do national teams representing at the World Cup stage, what can it do for a country? If you look at Wales, they have very much, come fully on board with the whole soccer diplomacy aspect and how their national team is a great way to gain visibility, increased visibility, and kind of punch above their cultural weight. I know they've been doing a lot of really interesting sports diplomacy programs. Here in the United States, I know they've got some things lined up both in New York as well as Washington, D.C., at DuPont Circle, I believe, next week. But using the soccer diplomacy that was first kind of launched through the television series Welcome to Wrexham, right? And then the national team qualified, and everything has kind of come into play. So, kind of two very different examples of what participation at the World Cup stage can do for teams and the symbolism, the communication, representation, and negotiation that can be involved on and off the pitch.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how these things play out, and especially the U.S. Iran game, but also just for folks that don't even realize that the whole British system and the Wales versus I mean just things like that, and they really are punching above their weight in a number of different ways. But to get you out of here on one last question, and I think you would make the argument that the U.S. government and other government entities have gotten better at using sports diplomacy over the decades. Still a long way to go, probably in your estimation. But what are some ways that you think they could do a better job of doing sports diplomacy, bringing it into line with other diplomatic initiatives, and also should there be more government activity, or is it more on the organizations themselves, like the NBA or the MLB or NFL? And we're recording this after just a few days after there was a huge welcome of the NFL teams to Germany over the weekend, and that, from all reports, sounded like it was a huge success. So where do you think forward momentum comes from on this? Should it be governments? Should it be the organizations themselves? Should it be a mixture of the two?
Thank you for giving me a soapbox. So I've
That's what we're
long
here for.
argued.
Yeah.
I've long argued that so sports diplomacy can be such a powerful, impactful tool in the diplomatic toolbox for anyone, when done with intention, right? The intentionality factor, and when done with authenticity. I think that's one of the really potent aspects of sports diplomacy. And I think the first thing that US policymakers need to realize is that sports diplomacy is far more than just programmatic people to people exchanges where you send your athletes overseas or you bring people to the United States. That has been the blueprint of US sports diplomacy for the past 20 some years. And that is great. It's wonderful. It is impactful and it has its place. But as the sports diplomacy field has evolved in the 21st century, sports diplomacy is much, much more than just programmatic programs, moving people from point A to point B. It has been harnessed and integrated up and down the policy ladder by many other governments. And so the first thing I would suggest for US policymakers is stop thinking of sports diplomacy as purely programmatic and start to think of it also as a policy tool that should be part of your integral policy making apparatus. Um, I think that's the first thing. And whether, education in terms of understanding how sports diplomacy has evolved since, the year 2000 and who is doing what. There's lots of, speaking to the, kind of government side of sports diplomacy, there's lots of really cool cutting edge sports diplomacy initiatives being taken by other governments around the world. Rwanda is doing, regardless of what you might think of the Rwandan government's, policies, its sports diplomacy initiatives are really kind of new and innovative, forging sponsorship partnerships with some of the world's top global soccer teams, hosting and kind of becoming a beacon of kind of a sports diplomacy efforts in Africa that have gotten many of its fellow African countries starting to formulate their own sports diplomacy policies so that it's not Rwanda gaining all the thunder. Wales, Australia, uh, France, to name just a few, there are many others that are in the works that are using sports diplomacy in their policymaking process as an integral part of their policymaking process. If you go to the government of France's, their Ministry of Foreign Affairs website, they spell out their entire sports diplomacy policy um, in French and in English, making it accessible, and explain how, since 2013, it has become integrated throughout their foreign policy and representation worldwide. Um, there's also really cool cutting edge stuff being done on the digital sports diplomacy front as well. So there's lots of opportunities, but the first thing is that US policymakers need to realize that it's not just programmatic, that it is policy and much more multifaceted and diffuse than I think many people think. And in terms of speaking really quickly to the last point, should it be a government led initiative or driven by the private sector? I think it should be both because the private sector, by and large, unless it's the basketball sector and the NBA, which has been taking their own initiatives and working with different governments, whether the US government or the Rwandan or Senegalese governments. Um, I think a lot of the private sector of the sports sector still think that sports diplomacy is only the practice of the government when that is no longer the case. So, I think it needs to, for the US, it needs to be a dual pronged initiative.
All right. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to chat with us today about sports diplomacy, the World Cup, and all of those things, and some good stuff. And go Team USA. We'll see if we can make it to the round of 16 this time. Who knows? Doubtful, but we'll see. Anyways, thanks, Lindsay.
Great. Thanks so much for having me.